Is this scenario of a palace coup to take Putin out even feasible? And is it actually a case of be careful what you wish for?
Well, quite, Dan, and you make a very good point. Now, as you know, I'm no huge fan of the Russian regime at all, but I do think people got to be careful. The first thing, as you say, we ought to consider what might replace Vladimir Putin. And as a Russian, it is a very sad thing for me to say that, historically speaking, Vladimir Putin is not exactly an outlier in terms of Russian leaders. So to imagine that, if he's ousted from power, he's going to be replaced by Nick Clegg is a little bit optimistic. You might actually find that in the middle of a war, you end up with someone who's far, far worse. So that's the first thing to say. The other thing to say, as you mentioned, I've been speaking to people on the ground in Russia and elsewhere. And one of the things I know is that thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Russian people who are against what's happening are leaving the country. So there's a neighboring country to Russia called Armenia, and some of my family are there at the moment, and they say that normally there's about 3 to 4 flights between Russia and Armenia a day. At the moment, there are 42. And that is people fleeing the country. So the people who are against the war are leaving or ending up in prison for the brave protests, as you mentioned. And the other side of it is that ordinary Russians, many of them who only watch state media, which is taken on Goebbels-like propaganda levels at this point, they are watching that media and they are persuaded by it. And they believe that what's happening in Ukraine is a so-called Nazi genocide. The Nazis are back and they've taken over Ukraine and they're murdering Russians in their droves. That's what they believe, to the point where we've seen, I don't know if you saw this, Dan, this week, there was a video of a Russian prisoner of war who talked about how shocked he was to discover that on arriving in Ukraine, there weren't swastikas everywhere. So that's what people are being told. And you've got to remember, Russia shut down Facebook, Twitter, all Western social media. So people don't have access to other types of information, even if they were keen to seek it out. And so you've got a situation where a country is essentially locked its informational borders. People are being brainwashed into believing a particular narrative. And, it's part of the Russian psyche that we must be strong. We must fight evil. We defeated Nazism 80 years ago in World War II, and we can do it again.
So Putin's tapped into that. I understand that. But Konstantin, do you get any sense that Russians, ordinary Russians, are starting to feel worried about the economic conditions? All of the Western companies are pulling out of the country, the value of the ruble plummeting. Is that starting to hit home at all?
You ask a very good question, Dan, but I think it betrays a misunderstanding, if you don't mind me saying. Yes, no, of course. Russians are concerned about the impact of the sanctions, but the question isn't whether they're concerned about the impact of the sanctions. The question is, who do they blame for the sanctions? Who do they blame for the war? And so far,
blame Putin.
They don't blame Putin, they blame the West. They consider this war to be a product of Western interference in Ukraine. They consider the sanctions to be wrong and illegitimate. And so they're not blaming Vladimir Putin. They consider him to be standing up for their interests, and the evil West is meddling in the affairs of the country. And
has Putin had a spike in popularity? Often that is something that happens when a country goes to war.
Yes, he has. Now, I always say you've got to be careful because polls, we've seen over the last 5 years polls in our own country here are not exactly reliable, but obviously in an authoritarian country like Russia, even less so. My own opinion is I don't think these latest polls are inaccurate. I think they're spot on. He has had a bump in popularity. Whether that's going to last is really the question, because your question about sanctions is the good one, Dan. Over time, whether the people still blame the West and not Vladimir Putin may be a different case. As things go on, we saw, for example, the collapse of the Soviet Union really was about the fact that the West bankrupted the Soviet Union by putting things in place and forcing the Soviet Union to engage in an arms race it couldn't afford. Whether over time people get tired of bread queues and all of the stuff that essentially led to the collapse of the Soviet Union remains to be seen.